The room went silent the moment it happened. Not gradually, not the kind of quiet that creeps in when conversation dies down. This was the kind of silence that slams into a room like a wall, sudden, total, and terrifying. Dante Mori, one of the most feared crime lords in all of Southern Europe, dropped to one knee. In the middle of his own penthouse, in front of 300 guests, in front of his entire organization. And he bowed his head to a man wearing a faded linen shirt, worn canvas shoes, and trousers that looked like they had been ironed with a damp cloth 20 years ago. The man the guests had been laughing at all evening. People had whispered about him the moment he walked in. Some had snickered openly. One woman near the bar had leaned to her companion and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Who let the janitor into the party?" And now Dante Mori, whose name made generals nervous, was on his knee. His voice, when it finally came, was low and reverent. "Godfather," he said, "forgive me for not receiving you properly. I did not know you had arrived." The old man in the worn linen shirt said nothing for a moment. He looked around the room slowly, the way a man looks at a garden he planted decades ago. His eyes were calm, almost amused. Then he placed one hand gently on Dante's shoulder and said, "Stand up, boy. You're embarrassing yourself." And just like that, the entire power structure of the room rearranged itself. Before we continue, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Subscribe. Let's see how global this story reaches. His name was Enzo Cavarra. He was 63 years old. He had white hair at his temples and a small scar beneath his left ear that he never explained. He wore simple clothes by choice, not poverty. He owned 4 properties across 3 countries and had not once in the last decade needed to raise his voice to make someone afraid. That was the thing about Enzo Cavarra. He didn't need theater. He had already seen what theater cost. He had built the Cavarra network from almost nothing, starting in the coastal city of Reggio when he was barely 22. It had taken blood, patience, sacrifice, and an almost inhuman ability to read people. By the time he was 40, entire crime families consulted him before making major moves. By the time he was 50, those same families did nothing without his approval. Then, 7 years ago, he vanished. Not dramatically, not with an announcement or a war or a public exit. He simply stopped appearing. He stepped back so quietly that most of the new generation in the underworld had no idea he was still alive. They knew the name Cavarra the way people know the names of ancient emperors, reverently, abstractly, like something that belonged to history rather than the present. That was exactly how he wanted it. Enzo had come to Rome for one reason, not to reclaim power, not to settle scores. He had come because his granddaughter was in trouble, and no one, not distance, not age, not his carefully constructed invisibility, was going to stop him from fixing it. Her name was Enzo Cavarra. She was 28, brilliant and furious with him, which he accepted as fair. She worked as a forensic accountant at a mid-sized firm in Rome, had a small apartment near Testaxio, and had spent the last 3 years building a life entirely outside the shadow of the Cavarra name. She was good at it. She was careful and disciplined, and she had a talent for finding the one number in 1,000 that didn't belong. That talent was exactly what had gotten her into danger. Isla had not meant to uncover anything. She had been hired 8 months ago to do a standard compliance audit for a logistics company called Varro Meridian. The kind of work that is boring by design, cross-referencing ledgers, checking import licenses, matching cargo manifests against invoices. Nothing glamorous. But Isla had found something on the 41st day. A pattern, small, almost invisible, buried inside 3 years of shipping records. Someone had been routing payments through a shell company in Cyprus, then fragmenting them through a series of charitable foundations in Malta and Lisbon, then reassembling them on the other end as clean, legitimate consulting fees. It was elegant laundering, genuinely sophisticated, the kind of thing that required both technical skill and institutional access. She had flagged it internally. Her supervisor had gone pale and told her to close the file and never mention it again. She had pushed back. Her supervisor had resigned the next morning. His replacement arrived and immediately reassigned Isla to a different project. 2 weeks later, someone had broken into her apartment. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was visibly disturbed. But Isla knew. She had a system, a small strip of tape across the inside of her file drawer that would tear if the drawer was opened more than 2 centimeters. It had torn. Her laptop had been moved 1 inch to the left of where she always placed it. And the framed photo on her desk, a picture of her and her mother taken in Sicily when Isla was 12, had been turned very slightly, as if someone had picked it up and examined it. Someone was sending her a message. She called her grandfather that night for the first time in 2 years. Enzo had listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 4 full seconds, which in Enzo's language was the equivalent of another man slamming his fist on a table. Then he said, "Don't touch anything at work. Don't discuss this with anyone. Go about your routine. I'll handle it." Isla had said, "I don't want you to handle it. I want advice." Enzo had said, "The advice is, let me handle it." She had hung up on him, which he also accepted as fair. He arrived in Rome 3 days later, taking a regional train under a name that had not been used in 12 years. He checked into a modest hotel near the Aventine Hill, not because he couldn't afford better, but because modest hotels ask fewer questions and remember fewer faces. The first thing he did was make 3 phone calls. The second thing he did was request an invitation to Dante Mori's function, which was being held at Dante's penthouse in Parioli to celebrate the expansion of Mori's legitimate real estate portfolio. Dante's assistant had not recognized the name on the request. Dante's assistant had therefore placed Enzo Cavarra on the secondary guest list, the overflow list, and arranged no car, no greeting, no accommodation. Enzo had taken a bus to the event. He had walked into the lobby in his linen shirt and his worn canvas shoes and been regarded by the security staff with polite, barely concealed disdain. He had been waved through after a cursory check because whoever he was, he clearly wasn't important enough to be a threat. He had taken a glass of water from the bar. He had eaten 1 bruschetta. He had stood near the window and watched the room with those calm, slightly amused eyes. That was when Dante's security chief, a man named Gasper who had been in the organization for 11 years, had crossed the room in 3 fast strides and gone white as chalk. He had recognized the scar, the small one under the left ear. He had gone directly to Dante and said 4 words into his ear. And Dante Mori, who feared almost nothing in the world, had crossed his own penthouse and dropped to 1 knee in front of a man in a faded linen shirt. The aftermath of that moment was something the guests would describe differently depending on who they were. Some said the old man had seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. Some said he had looked through the room like he was cataloging everyone in it. A few of the older guests, those who had been in the business long enough to know history, had left the party early, quietly, with the particular expression of people who have just remembered something they had tried to forget. Dante gave Enzo his private study for the remainder of the evening. It was a good study. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk the size of a small boat. Dante sat across from Enzo and said nothing for a long moment, which was also his version of respect. Then he said, "I would have arranged things properly if I had known." "I know," Enzo said. "That's why I didn't tell you." Dante absorbed this. "You wanted to see how things run when you're not expected." "I always do." Another silence. Then Dante said, "What do you need?" "Varro Meridian," Enzo said. "Tell me what you know about it." Dante's jaw shifted slightly. "That's Ronan Vale's operation." The name landed in the room with weight. Ronan Vale was not Roman. He was Belgian-born, had spent his formative years in Amsterdam, and had arrived in Italy 7 years ago with impeccable legitimate credentials, a venture capital background, a minor art collection, a talent for throwing parties that attracted politicians and celebrities. He had built a surface so smooth and plausible that most people in the legitimate world had no idea he was anything other than an investor. But in the other world, The one that operated underneath Rome's beautiful streets. Ronan Vale was known as something else. He was known as a cleaner, not in the violent sense, in the financial sense. He cleaned money for organizations that needed someone smart enough to make it invisible and greedy enough not to ask too many questions. He was also known, Dante now said quietly, for having a very short temper when it came to people who noticed things they shouldn't. He's not someone you want to move against quietly, Dante said. He has connections in the financial police, 2 judges. He's built his protection carefully. Everyone builds their protection carefully, Enzo said. Everyone still has a weakness. What's yours? Dante asked. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. Enzo looked at him steadily. My granddaughter, which is why we're having this conversation. Isla did not know her grandfather was in Rome for 4 more days. She found out because she came home from work on a Thursday evening to find Enzo sitting at her kitchen table, drinking coffee he had made from her own machine, reading a newspaper he had apparently brought from outside. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she said, "You cannot just come into my apartment." The lock needed replacing, Enzo said pleasantly. I had someone look at it while I was here. You should thank me. Who gave you a key? No one. I had one made. Sit down, Isla. She sat down, not because she was obedient. She was genuinely the least obedient person Enzo had ever raised, but because she could read his face, and something in it was serious in a way that went past the usual. Ronan Vale, Enzo said. She looked at him carefully. You already know who it is. I know a great deal. I want to know what you found specifically, not the summary, the details. She studied him for another moment. Then she got up, went to her bedroom, and came back with a USB drive that she had been keeping inside a hollowed-out book on her shelf. She plugged it into her laptop and turned it so Enzo could see the screen. He leaned forward and looked at the data for a long time without speaking. When he finally sat back, he said, "This is thorough." I know what I'm doing, she said. I know you do. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, something between pride and grief, which was an uncomfortable combination on any face. Your mother would have said the same thing. She was thorough, too. A short silence. Isla's mother, Enzo's daughter, had died when Isla was 16. It was not a subject they navigated easily. Don't do that, Isla said quietly. I'm not doing anything. I'm saying you're good at your job. Then treat me like a professional and tell me what you're planning. Enzo looked at her. She held his gaze. They were remarkably similar in this way, that flat, patient refusal to be the first one to look away. Finally, he said, I'm going to speak to Vale. That's not a plan. That's a sentence. It will be enough. He broke into my apartment. He's not going to be impressed by a conversation. He's not supposed to be impressed, Enzo said quietly. He's supposed to be afraid. The meeting with Ronan Vale was arranged through an intermediary. Vale agreed to it with some puzzlement. The name Cavarra had reached him, but like most of the newer generation, it had reached him as legend rather than living fact. He had agreed mostly out of curiosity, the way a man might agree to meet a collector who owns an artifact he has only read about. They met at a private restaurant in Trastevere, closed for the occasion, 8 people total between them, which was Enzo's insistence. He disliked crowds during important conversations. They interfered with the acoustics of fear. Vale arrived in a very good suit. He was 50, fit, with the kind of groomed self-confidence that came from having never once been seriously outmaneuvered. He looked at Enzo across the table, and his expression was politely uncertain, the way it would be if someone had told him this elderly man in unremarkable clothes was actually a chess grandmaster. Possible, not viscerally convincing. Enzo ordered soup. Vale ordered nothing and said, with professional courtesy, I understand you wanted to speak. I'll be honest, I wasn't aware you were still active. I'm not, Enzo said. This is personal. Personal, Vale tilted his head. What does that mean? The forensic accountant at the firm you retained, the one who found the Cyprus routing. Vale's expression did not change dramatically, but something behind his eyes tightened, the way a fist tightens. I don't know what you're referring to. That's fine, Enzo said. You don't need to know what I'm referring to. You need to know that she is my granddaughter, that nothing will happen to her, that the file she built will be delivered to a source I trust rather than to law enforcement, which means your name will not appear in a courtroom. In exchange, you leave her alone entirely. You remove whatever pressure you've placed on her employer. You ensure that her career continues without interference. He paused. And you never again send anyone into the home of someone I love. Vale looked at him for a long moment. And if I don't agree, he said. Enzo ate a spoonful of soup. Then tomorrow morning, the file goes to 3 separate investigative journalists I have trusted for many years. Not law enforcement journalists. And you will discover that the story they write is far more damaging than any courtroom, because courtrooms can be delayed and appeals can be filed, but a well-sourced article is immediate and permanent. He set his spoon down. I'm also told you have a son at university in Ghent. He is studying architecture. He seems to be building a respectable life, completely unaware of how his tuition is funded. It would be a shame to have that clarity arrive suddenly. The table was very quiet. Vale's hands, which had been resting casually on the tablecloth, were now very still in the specific way hands go still when their owner is deciding something important. He said, You're threatening me with exposure. I'm offering you a clean arrangement, Enzo said. The threat is the alternative. Those are different things. Another silence, long enough that one of Vale's men shifted uncomfortably near the wall. Then Vale said, Fine. Just that, fine. Enzo nodded and finished his soup. Isla did not learn the details of the meeting for another week. She learned them because Enzo told her, not everything, but enough. He sat at her kitchen table again, this time with a pastry he had brought from a place he apparently remembered from 40 years ago and had been pleased to find still operating. And he explained in careful terms that the pressure on her had been removed, that her position at the firm would no longer be complicated, and that the file she had built was now safely placed where it could do careful, controlled damage over time without putting her in the center of it. She listened without speaking until he finished. Then she said, You used the Cavarra name. I used my name, he said. It's the same thing. Yes, he admitted, it is. I spent 3 years making sure that name wasn't attached to me, she said. Her voice was not loud. It was the flat, measured tone of someone being very precise about something that hurts. I built a career. I have colleagues who don't know what my family is. I have a life that is mine. I know, Enzo said. And you walked in and used the weight of everything you built, everything I've spent years separating myself from, to fix my problem. Yes. She looked at him. Was there another way? He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. There might have been slower ways, he said finally. None of them guaranteed, none of them fast enough to be sure you were safe. She looked at the pastry he'd brought. I hate that this is how it works. So do I, he said quietly. I have always hated it. I built it anyway because I thought it was necessary. I still think it was necessary. I also know it cost things I didn't fully account for at the time. A long silence. My mother, Isla said. He nodded slowly, among other things. Isla looked away, toward the window. The light outside was the soft amber of late afternoon, the kind Rome specializes in, generous and a little melancholy. She had her grandmother's eyes, Enzo had always thought, dark and direct and capable of seeing through things. I'm not grateful, she said. You don't have to be. But I'm also not, she stopped, started again. You came, you got on a train, you didn't send anyone, you came yourself. Of course. Don't say of course like it's obvious. For most men in your position, it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are the last thing I have that matters in the way family is supposed to matter. Not obligation, not legacy. You, he paused. I am aware that I spent many years prioritizing the wrong things. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm also not going to pretend that it changes what I would do if you were in danger. Ulla didn't say anything for a while. Then she picked up the pastry, broke off a piece, and slid the rest toward him. He accepted it. It was not forgiveness. It was not resolution. It was two people eating pastry in a small kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, which was its own kind of language. There is a person in this story who has not been introduced yet, because stories are rarely only about the people we think they are about. His name was Mafia. He was 31. He worked for Dante Mori in a capacity that was officially described as logistics coordination, which meant in practice that he moved things between places and people and ensured that the moving happened without problems. He was quiet, methodical, and had a gift for planning that Dante valued enormously. He was also, by the accounting of everyone who knew him, a person of unusual integrity for the world he operated in, not naive, not soft, but genuinely committed to a personal code that he had never been able to articulate precisely, but that everyone around him could recognize. He had been present the night Enzo Cavarra arrived at Dante's party. He had been one of the people who laughed. Not cruelly, he was not a cruel person by nature, but he had smiled at the whispers about the man in the worn clothes, amused by the absurdity of it, the way you smile at a joke before you understand what it actually means. And then he had watched Dante Mori drop to one knee, and he had felt something he couldn't name immediately. Later, when he thought about it more carefully, he identified it as recolibration, the particular internal shift that happens when the world rearranges its categories in front of you. He had gone home that night and thought for a long time about what it meant that power could look like an old man in a linen shirt. What it meant that he had needed to be shown it rather than recognizing it. What assumptions he carried that he hadn't known were assumptions. He told none of this to anyone. He was not someone who narrated his own interior life to others, but it stayed with him. He met Ulla 6 weeks after Enzo's visit. It happened the way most important things happen, sideways, without announcement, in the context of something else entirely. Dante had retained Ulla's firm for a legitimate compliance review of one of his real estate holdings. This was Enzo's arrangement. One of the quieter benefits of the meeting in Trasteva was that Enzo had suggested, gently, that Dante's organization direct some genuine legitimate business toward the firm where Ulla worked, to shore up her standing there without anyone being able to identify it as deliberate. Mafia had been sent to the firm's office to deliver documentation. He had arrived at the wrong time, early, by 15 minutes, and had been asked to wait in a small glass-walled conference room while the relevant partner was located. Ulla had come in to retrieve something from the printer in the same room. She had looked at him with the direct, assessing look that was her natural register for strangers, and said, "Are you here for the Murray review?" "Yes," he said. She had looked at the stack of documents he was carrying. "You have the subsidiary filings upside down. The ones on top should be the parent company structure." He looked at the stack. She was correct. He rearranged them. She nodded and left. He thought about that encounter for the rest of the day, which surprised him, because it was objectively a very short and unremarkable encounter. But there was something in the way she had said it, not pointed or condescending, just accurate, that he found himself replaying. He went back to the firm 3 days later with a correction to one of the documents. This was only partly necessary. Mostly it was an excuse. She was coming out of a meeting when he arrived. She stopped when she saw him. "You again." "Corrected filing," he said and held it out. She took it, glanced at it, looked back up at him. "You could have emailed this." "I was in the area." She studied him for a moment with those dark, direct eyes. Then she said, "Are you going to tell me who you actually are, or should I guess?" He blinked. "My name is Mafia. I work for." "I know who you work for," she said. "I meant, are you going to tell me why you're actually here?" A pause. "I'm not sure yet," he said, which was more honest than he intended. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "There's a coffee place around the corner. I have 20 minutes. The 20 minutes became an hour. Not because they talked about anything significant. They didn't, not yet. They talked about the city, about the particular absurdity of Roman traffic, about a documentary she had recently watched about deep-sea geology that she couldn't fully explain why she had found so compelling. He told her about a book he was in the middle of, a history of Byzantine trade routes, which she found genuinely interesting rather than feigning interest. She was funny, he discovered, dry and a little unexpected in her humor, the kind of funny that you almost miss if you're not paying close attention. He was perceptive, she noticed. He asked questions that landed accurately, without preamble, as if he'd skipped 3 steps of social convention and gone directly to the thing he actually wanted to know. She found this disarming in a way she didn't immediately want to examine. When she stood up to leave, she said, "You still haven't told me why you came back." "Neither have you asked," he said. "I just did." He looked at her directly. "I wanted to." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Well, you're employed by people I'm currently reviewing." "I know. That's a complication." "I know that too." "So," she picked up her bag. "So," he agreed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "The review concludes in 3 weeks." And she left. He sat at the table for a while after she was gone, with the specific expression of someone who has just understood that they are in considerably more trouble than they had anticipated, and that they are somehow fine with this. 3 weeks is a long time when you're waiting for something. It is also a short time when you are afraid of what comes after. Allah finished the review on a Friday. It was clean. Dante Mori's real estate holdings were legitimate enough that the review presented no problems. She submitted the report. She closed the file. She sat at her desk for a moment after doing so, aware of a particular sensation she couldn't quite name. Her phone rang 20 minutes later, a number she didn't have saved. She answered. Matoa said, "The review closed today." "It did," she said. "I wanted to make sure you knew that." "I did know. I was the one who filed it." A brief pause. "I'm calling to ask if you'd like to have dinner." She was quiet for a moment. "This is a terrible idea." "Probably," he said. "You work for people I've just finished auditing." "I know. My family history is," she stopped, "complicated. I've noticed that people in this city have complicated family histories," he said. "It seems to be a local tradition." She surprised herself by laughing, short and genuine. "Saturday," she said. 7 o'clock. There's a place in Pugnuta I like. I'll send you the address." "Good," he said. She hung up and sat for another moment in the afternoon quiet of her office. Then she picked up her phone again and almost called her grandfather, then didn't, then went back to work. Their first real evening together was long and good in the particular way that good evenings are: not dramatic, not cinematic, just the slow, deepening sense of someone becoming more interesting to you the more they speak. She told him about the audit work she found most compelling, the way financial crimes left patterns, the way the patterns were almost always the same even when the method changed, the strange intimacy of understanding how someone thought by looking at what they did with money. He told her about his work in terms that were careful but not dishonest. He did not describe what he did in detail. He described what it required: patience, precision, the ability to hold a large number of moving pieces in your head simultaneously. She listened with the particular quality of attention that told him she understood exactly what he was and wasn't saying. She said, "You're good at this, not telling me things." "I'm good at a lot of things that I'm not sure are virtues." That's either very self-aware or very good self-presentation. He looked at her steadily. "Both, probably." She smiled. "I respect that you admit it." They closed the restaurant down, walked out onto the street in the particular Rome quiet that settles after 11, when the traffic thins and the air carries the warmth it has collected from the stones all day. At the corner where they would separate, she said, "I need you to know something about me." "Tell me," he said. "I spent 3 years building a life that was specifically not about where I came from. The name, the family, the weight of all of it. I'm very serious about that life. I'm not casual about protecting it." He looked at her quietly. I understand that. Do you? Because the world you're in, the world your employer is in, it doesn't always respect the lines people draw for themselves. I know, he said, and then, because she deserved honesty rather than reassurance. I can't promise you that the world is different than it is. I can only tell you what I would do, which is not cross your lines. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm Roman night. Then she said, okay. Just that. And she walked away down the quiet street, and he watched her go, and he thought that this was going to be one of the most important things that had ever happened to him, and he was not wrong. It took 4 more months before she told him about her grandfather. She did it on an evening in February in her apartment, because they had been spending more evenings in her apartment by then. It had become a comfortable gravity, the way these things do when both people stop pretending the pull isn't there. She told him the way she told him most things, directly, without preamble, in the flat, precise tone she used when something mattered. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Enzo Cavarra is your grandfather. Yes. I was at the party, he said. She looked at him. What? Dante's party in Parioli 7 months ago. He paused. I was one of the people who laughed. The room was very quiet. You laughed at him, she said carefully. I didn't know who he was, and he stopped. I'm not telling you this to excuse it. I'm telling you because you just told me the truth and I want to give you the same thing back. He looked at her steadily. I've thought about that night many times since, not because of what I know now about who he is, but because of what it showed me about what I assumed. I saw an old man in ordinary clothes and I made a judgment in about 4 seconds and I was completely wrong. She studied him. I'm not the most important person that applies to, he said, but it applies to me. She was quiet for a long moment. He'd find this funny, she said finally, in his way. Should I be afraid of him? Matteo asked. Probably, Isla said, but you'd have to meet him first for that to matter. The meeting happened on a Sunday. Enzo had come to Rome again. He was doing this more frequently now, which he did not comment on and which Isla did not point out, because some things are better accepted than examined. He came for lunch. He brought pastry again from the same place. Matteo arrived precisely on time, which Enzo noted. He also noted the quality of stillness in the younger man, not nervousness, exactly, but a genuine attention, the kind that comes from someone who has learned to read rooms rather than just occupying them. They ate lunch. Enzo asked 3 questions about Matteo's work that sounded like small talk and were not. Matteo answered them honestly, which Enzo noticed, and which cost Matteo more than being evasive would have. After lunch, Enzo and Matteo sat at the kitchen table while Isla cleared things, and Enzo said, You work for Dante. Yes, Matteo said. Are you good at it? I'm told so. Is that why you do it? Matteo looked at him directly. I do it because it pays well and because I'm good at it. I'm aware those are unsatisfying reasons for someone in your position to hear. I don't have a better answer that's also honest. Enzo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My granddaughter is not my property. She doesn't need my approval to make choices. I want you to understand that. He paused. I also want you to understand that she is the most important person in my world, and if you cause her grief, intentionally or carelessly, you will not need to imagine how I'd respond to that. Matteo nodded. I understand. Good, Enzo said. He picked up his coffee. The pastry place I've been going to needs more customers. Tell your friends. That was the end of the evaluation. Isla came back from the kitchen and looked at them both. Neither said anything. She said, Did he threaten you? He mentioned a pastry place, Matteo said. She looked at Enzo. Enzo drank his coffee. She sat back down and decided this was probably the closest to a blessing she was going to get, and that it was enough. The months that followed were quiet. Not uneventfully quiet life doesn't offer that, especially not the lives these people were living at the edges of. Dante's organization had a difficult season. Matteo worked through it steadily. as was his nature. Isla's firm took on a major case that demanded everything she had for 6 weeks straight. There were evenings they were both too tired to do more than sit near each other without talking, which turned out to be its own kind of closeness. Vale, for his part, kept his word. The pressure on Isla's firm dissolved as though it had never been. He pivoted his operation toward different arrangements in different cities, which was the pragmatic response of a man who has been quietly and efficiently reminded of his own limitations. The file Enzo had promised to deliver to trusted journalists was delivered in portions over the following year, carefully timed, always traceable to sources other than Isla, designed to do exactly as much damage as necessary without drawing her into the blast radius. It was the kind of patient, precise work that Enzo had always specialized in, the kind that takes longer but holds. Ronan Vale's name appeared in a Milanese investigative piece 14 months later, in connection with the Cyprus entities. It was not enough for a prosecution. It was enough to cost him 3 of his largest clients, which in the relevant world was a more serious consequence. Enzo came to Rome for Christmas. He stayed in Isla's apartment, on the small sofa in the living room, which he claimed was perfectly adequate and which Isla knew he was lying about but did not argue. He brought pastry. He brought a bottle of wine from a region he had visited decades ago and had never stopped thinking about. Matteo came for dinner on Christmas Eve. He brought olive oil from a village in Umbria that a colleague had recommended, and which turned out to be excellent. He and Enzo argued genially about Byzantine trade routes over the main course, having discovered a mutual interest that neither of them had announced, and that pleased Isla in a way she found difficult to articulate, the particular pleasure of watching 2 people you love discover they can talk to each other. After dinner, Enzo went to bed early, as he always did, and Isla and Matteo sat by the window with the remainder of the wine and looked at the city below. She said, "He seems well." "He does," Matteo said. "He's been coming more often." "I know." A comfortable silence. "He's lonely," she said quietly. "He built something that required him to be removed from people, and now he's old and the structure is still there, the distance, the formality, all of it, but he doesn't want it anymore." She paused. "I don't think he ever wanted it, actually. I think he thought it was the price and paid it without checking whether the transaction was worth it." Matteo looked at her. "You've forgiven him." "I haven't forgiven him," she said. "I've understood him. That's different. Forgiveness implies I've decided what he owes me. I've just decided that what he is more complicated than what I was angry at." "That might be more generous than forgiveness," Matteo said. She thought about it. Maybe. She looked at the city. "He's going to come for Easter, too. He's already asked." "Good," Matteo said. She looked at him. Something in the way he said it, simple, genuine, without complication. "You're a good person," she said. It was not a small thing for her to say. The directness of it surprised even her. He looked at her for a moment. "I work for a crime organization and have done things that wouldn't survive a great deal of moral scrutiny." "I know," she said. "I didn't say you were a simple person. I said you were a good one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what comes after, what I do next, whether what I'm doing now is what I want to still be doing in 10 years. She said nothing, giving him the space. "I don't have an answer yet," he said. "I'm not asking for one," she said. "I'm telling you I'm here for whatever it turns out to be." He looked at her in the warm light of the apartment, with the city below and the old man asleep in the next room, and he thought that this ordinary, complex, imperfect, specific life was what he had been trying to name for the last year without knowing it. "Okay," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, Rome held its ancient, indifferent beauty, and the night went on, and the wine was almost gone, and it was enough. The last thing worth telling is small. 3 weeks into the new year, Matteo handed Dante Mori his resignation. Carefully prepared, professionally worded, personally delivered. He offered 6 months of transition support. He suggested a replacement. He was thorough and fair about it, as he was thorough and fair about most things. Dante accepted it without argument, which surprised Matteo. Then Dante said, "Cavarra suggested this might happen." Matteo looked at him. "When?" "Christmas, he called me. We spoke for 20 minutes. Dante paused. "He said the ones worth keeping are the ones who know when to leave." Matteo thought about that for a long moment. "Did he say anything else?" he asked. "He said the pastry place near Aventine is worth visiting." Dante looked faintly bewildered. "He mentioned it twice." Matteo smiled. He went to the pastry place that afternoon, tried the cornetti, which were very good, thought about old men who had built enormous, complicated, costly things, and then spent their final years taking trains under false names to sit at kitchen tables and drink coffee. Thought about the difference between power that makes you untouchable and power that keeps the people you love safe. Thought that maybe those weren't the same thing at all. He bought an extra pastry and took it home. Power does not always look the way we expect it to. It does not always arrive in a good suit, or with a motorcade, or with men who stand close and say nothing. Sometimes it arrives in worn canvas shoes, on a regional train, carrying nothing but a name that a roomful of well-dressed people has entirely forgotten to be afraid of, until they remember all at once what forgetting cost them. And sometimes the most important thing a powerful person ever does is small. A phone call, a train journey, a pastry from a shop they remembered. A decision to spend the years they have left at a kitchen table in a small apartment in Rome, in the company of a granddaughter who is still deciding how much to forgive, and a young man learning what kind of person he wants to be, and the particular stubborn, ordinary beauty of people choosing each other anyway, in full knowledge of everything, with nothing hidden and nothing resolved perfectly, and everything somehow all right. That is the story of Enzo Cavarra, who was feared by many and loved by few, and who, in the end, chose the few. And meant it. If this story pulled you in from start to finish, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Your support keeps these worlds alive. See you in the next story.